Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Spear, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we have a lot to talk about. We'll discuss last night's politically motivated killing of two Israelis outside of a Jewish event in D.C. and what it tells us about the state of anti-Semitism. We'll also cover Donald Trump's Oval Office meeting with his South African counterpart and what to make of the administration's focus on the African country. And finally, we'll wrap up with a new book by Globe and Mail columnist Andrew Coyne that's generating a lot of buzz in Canadian political circles. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
David, we're regrettably speaking the morning after a young couple was shot and killed by a pro-Palestinian activist outside of a Jewish event in D.C. It ostensibly reflects the amped up environment in which we currently find ourselves. Why don't you reflect on what happened and what it might tell us?
Yeah. Well, incitement kills. There has been 18 months of anti-Jewish incitement by radical groups in North America. We have examples of people organizing demonstrations in front of nursing homes, in front of people's homes. We have an infiltration of North American groups by people with sympathies to much more extreme, even radically terrorist groups abroad. And governments have accepted all this as a cost of doing business, and Canadian governments have been even more accepting than American governments. We mourn with these families of these two beautiful young people who are in love and going to be married. And I think Canadians should take a warning. This is coming to Toronto and Montreal. It's a little slow because it's harder to get weapons in Canada than it is in the United States, but it's not impossible to get weapons in Canada. And the people who want weapons will find them, and the people who want to target Jews and Friends of Israel will do so. And governments need to step up. The new Carney government is sending some very bad signals of social permission to anti-Jewish agitation. And governments need to be clear, and they need to stop saying, we condemn anti-Semitism and also the list of the following 8 things, because the incitement is not against the list of the following 8 things. The incitement
Yes.
is against Jews specifically. And if you don't tailor your response to the threat, you're going to miss the threat.
Yeah, well, you went precisely where I wanted to take the conversation, David. Political leaders, civic leaders, law enforcement, and others in Canada and indeed in the United States have struggled to find their voice in the
Yeah.
face of this agitation on our streets, on our campuses, and other parts of our society. Talk a bit more about the lessons from the past 24 hours or so, and how Canadian political leaders and others should internalize them.
Well, one thing that Canadian leaders should internalize is they need to stop yielding to things that they know to be lies because they think it's convenient. Um, there's obviously tremendous human suffering in Gaza, and uh, the fact that that suffering was triggered by Hamas and it was an inevitable product of Hamas's actions. It doesn't make the suffering any less terrible for the people caught up in it. Um, but government should be active in refuting lies like imminent famine, genocide. It's enough to describe things as they are, because when you give permission to the lie, you also give permission to the liar, and you give permission to the people who are incited by the liar, and you give permission ultimately to the violence that ensues from the incitement by the liar. And I really do worry that the Carney government in particular has decided they're going to do a very familiar thing that happens in the Canadian Liberal Party, which is liberal governments sometimes go to the left on domestic issues, and then they correct and go more to the right on domestic issues. But when they go to the right on domestic issues, they pay for that detour by allowing the farther left of the party to run foreign policy. And so you would see every time in the Elliott Trudeau days, when the government would have to balance its budget, it would then do a visit to Castro and praise Castro, because that was a way of appeasing a certain portion of its caucus that was unhappy with the budget balancing. And I worry a lot that that is Carney's same plan, which is to say, okay, we're going to give the left of our party, we're going to give them the Gaza file in exchange for the center of the party running the economy.
Yeah, we're speaking, of course, against the backdrop of this statement that Prime Minister Carney signed with his British and French counterparts, condemning the Israeli government as offensive into Gaza and threatening "quote unquote" action in
Yeah.
response. Although when media followed up with the prime minister's office, it didn't have an answer on what those actions might look like. But as you say, David, it reflects a bigger dynamic within the Liberal Party itself. To understand the Liberal Party's election win last month, one has to recognize that it didn't simply rely on traditional liberal support. It absorbed something like 25 to 50% of New Democratic support. And many of us have been wondering how that may influence the government's policy agenda, both domestically and looking globally. Talk a bit about the decision by the Prime Minister to sign on this statement, going further, in fact, than Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had in publicly challenging or criticizing the Netanyahu government. What might it say about the Prime Minister Carney's efforts to sort of balance these tensions within his government, and what are the risks for Canadian policy vis-a-vis Israel, and perhaps more broadly?
Well, in the past, Canadian governments have hesitated to veer too far in anti-Israel directions, lest they lose influence in Washington. Uh, I One of the consequences and costs of the Trump policy is because influence in Washington doesn't exist and buys you nothing, because there's no consistent American policy on anything anyway. So what would you do with the influence? Because it's like trying to influence a Ouija board, which is flittering all over the place in response to unconscious impulses. Um, Carney seems less worried about that, and he seems to fancy himself as a central figure in a kind of EU bloc. Um, Canada can be a good faith bargainer to help to close the gaps between the EU and the United States that have been so unfortunately opened by the Trump administration, but it's never going to be an EU state. It is located where it's located. It's a
Yes.
big landmass far away from Europe, and that's not going to change. And Canada's interests are very much north-south, and the Trump administration won't be there forever, pending a second and more successful coup attempt by President Trump. Um, so uh, this seems unfortunate. It seems unwise by the British and French governments too. Um, the way you get a resolution in Gaza is by devising a security structure for Gaza, not by hectoring the Israelis.
David, before we move on to another subject, just as we wrap up on this one, something we've talked about in previous episodes is how countries like Canada should be thinking about a post-Hamas Gaza and how they can support stability in the region rather than issuing statements from afar. If you were advising the Carney government, how should be thinking about its foreign policy vis-a-vis a post-conflict period, and how to contribute to the region?
Well, look, the very first thing I say is start with a blank piece of paper and ask yourself, why does Canada need a policy on Gaza at all? In what way is there a Canadian interest here? Canada has many other interests. You can see the Canadian interest in Ukraine, because Canada cares about the peace and stability of Europe. But that this issue, which is obviously so driven by Canadian domestic politics and doesn't reflect Canadian, maybe there's an option of just saving your juice, saving your battery, spending your foreign policy energy in other areas. I'm a bore on this topic of Canada needs to invest more in its relationship with Mexico. Take all the smart people, or all the people, and in working on Gaza, and redirect them. Tell them to learn Spanish, and they're going to be spending time in not only the embassy in Mexico City, but the consulate in Monterrey. Focus on what's most important. But if you must have a stance, then stop subordinating it to the need to placate the left wing of the Liberal Party caucus, which believes in untruths like that the UN can keep assistance away from Hamas. That is not true. Any money you give to the UN is going to Hamas, and that just needs to be said and understood and internalized. So if you that the task is, how do you create a security structure in Gaza that prevents another sneak attack like the one that Hamas launched on October 7th? That is the cause of all the suffering in Gaza. Israel is reacting to something that Israel did not choose. And if you allow Hamas to perpetuate, then you will have another October 7th and more suffering. So I don't know how much Canada has to contribute. And again, I would ask the Canadian government, maybe this is something you just can't. There are lots of things that Canada doesn't have an opinion on. Why can't this be one of them?
Yeah. Uh, Talking about what on the face of it looks like marginal foreign policy questions, this week we had another spectacle in the Oval Office where the Trump administration summoned a delegation from South Africa, including the the president's counterpart,
Yeah,
to essentially prosecute the case of genocide occurring against whites in South Africa. Talk
yeah.
a bit about what we saw play out in the Oval Office and what to make of the administration's focus on these issues in South Africa.
Um, the administration's focus on the plight of South African farmers seems bizarre in that if you are worried about the direction South Africa is going in, and there's a lot to worry about, this seems like issue 19. So the South African government, which made converted to majority rule democracy in the early 1990s, um, it's a very corrupt government. It's a government that is failing to provide all kinds of essential services like electricity. It's a country that has tremendous, if you're concerned about equal justice, that does have discrimination against many different groups um, in the places where the economic dynamism is in South Africa, which is in the cities, in the job market. They do have elaborate forms of racial quotas. Um, and if that's going to be your interest, that's the place to start. It's also South Africa has also because of its own internal ethnic politics, set in motion this defamatory action against Israel at the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide. That's something that a president might take on. But there is this very boutique group of right-wingers in the United States who have made the cause of the South African white farmer their exclusive concern about all the other problems in the crime. I didn't mention the crime and violence, which claims, by the way, overwhelmingly black victims. Um, and this focus is just on the facts, bizarre. The present president, Cyril Ramaphosa, has been a very strong friend to commercial farming in South Africa, and most of the commercial farmers are white. There's been a tendency for land to consolidate in fewer hands in South Africa, and that's because South Africa is a place, and I've recommended on Twitter some places to read about this. There's abundant land in South Africa. Water is scarce. So the point is not to get your hands on land because you want land, there's land. There's 2.5 million hectares or thereabouts of government-owned unused farmland that's sitting idle because it's not sufficiently watered. This is all about water rights. And the people who have the land that is watered are commercial farmers who sell to the export market, and they're overwhelmingly white. And that the tendency has been for poorer white farmers to lose their land to the better funded commercial operations because of the water and therefore the technology problem. But this is a boutique issue on the far, far, far edge of the American right, and it has somehow showed up at the Oval Office in a way that is both factually misplaced, but also just like a weird. Like you're taking South Africa, which is not a top American concern, take one of the less important issues in South Africa as opposed to the others that are more important. And even if your interest is to protect South African whites, it's very few South African whites are farmers. And it just sounds like something that is crossed up from like the Tucker Carlson comments page, bubbled up into Elon Musk's brain, and from there into the Oval Office and the presidency of the United States.
As you know, David, this past week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio appeared before a Senate committee hearing where he was subject to questions about this precise topic. Key Democratic senators essentially argued that the focus on these issues amounted to an expression of racism. To what extent do you think race is reflected in the administration's overemphasis on these questions?
Yeah, it's boutique racism. Like if you were just like a person who say, look, I'm a white American. I have solidarity with white South Africans. Okay, and just I'm asserting my racial solidarity, white man to white man. What about the ones who live in the cities? They have problems. Like the plight of the sub-commercial white Afrikaner farmer. That is such a specialty form of that's not racism. That is like comment section Tucker Carlson weird focus of some kind of like subgroup, and it's just bizarre. But there is maybe even an even larger point, which is, Oval Office meetings are not supposed to be like game show surprise episodes where
Yes.
you invite the world leader into the chair and see what happens. Sometimes he gets a prize, sometimes he gets a goat, sometimes there's a whoopee cushion on, sometimes there's an electric shock. And when Mark Carney visits, the question of will Trump behave himself? Like The background assumption should be the president is not going to behave like some deranged game show lunatic. That
Yes.
should be your baseline. Some meetings are more productive, some are less, but there's never a kind of bzzzt, haha, you are this week's unfortunate loser in the game of visit the crazy president.
It reminds me, just in parentheses, of that hilarious Seinfeld episode when Cosmo Kramer somehow gets his hands on a game show set and has the different his friends coming in and acting as guests on his show. There's something like that playing out in the Oval Office. You raise a bigger point though that is worth putting to you, and that is the extent to which fringe voices tend to have disproportionate influence over this administration through sometimes direct channels, like Laura Loomer
Yeah.
presenting a list of people who ought to be fired from the administration because they've crossed some line in her mind, to these indirect sources of influence through the podcasters and YouTubers and others who seem to be part of the president or those around him's information consumption. Why don't you talk a bit about that and how that differs, say, from your experience in the Bush administration?
Well, this White House must be haunted by the unhappy ghost of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Because when Dwight Eisenhower became president in the early 1950s, one of the things that bothered him was the complete chaos of process in the Roosevelt administration and the Truman
Hmm.
administration that followed it. Franklin D. Roosevelt was many great things, but he was not a good administrator. And his administration was an improvisatory chaos. And so the White House staff system, as we know it, is something that Eisenhower imported from the Army and institutionalized that all the modern White House staff, and that's why the executive office building is the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. It's not
Hmm.
just to honor him because he was a great man and a great general. He's also the creator of the White House staff system that operates out of the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. And one of the things that staff it begins with the assumption the president's time is finite and should be allocated according to some rational pre-existing set of criteria. If the president can only read so many pages a day, which pages should those be? The president can only see so many people a day. Who should he see? He's got a bucket of minutes. How should those minutes be spent? And
Yes.
if you think of the White House staff as a whole system that is concerned above all to allocate the president's time and information flow, and to make sure that all of that is used in the most intelligent and effective way. Remembering also that the president is a human being who needs to eat, who needs to sleep, who needs to spend time with his children and his spouse. All of that, Andy Card, who was W. Bush's chief of staff, whom I knew a little bit, used to say that when he began planning, he always began planning the president's personal time. When will the president see his wife? When are moments available for him to talk to his children? When would he exercise? When would he sleep? And then you built the rest of the day around those fundamental human needs.
Yes.
This White House, it just seems to be, I mean, it's run like a small town sheriff's office. You wander in and say, hey, that there's a domestic over on Jefferson Avenue. Maybe we should go investigate that, or maybe we should look at the poaching.
Yes. Yes. Or the plight of white farmers in South Africa. David, before we wrap up, I want to put to you some questions about a new book by our mutual friend
Yeah,
Andrew Coyne called "The Crisis of Canadian Democracy," which really applies, I think, a tough judgment
yeah.
to Canadian democratic institutions and the practice of Canadian democracy. Why don't you just start by reflecting on the book, its key insights, and why you think it may be important in the current moment?
Well, Andrew Coyne is a friend of both of ours. We admire him very much. One of Andrew's great gifts is he retains into the maturity of his literary, political, intellectual career the ability to be shocked by the things that everyone was shocked by when they were 20, and then learn over time to say, that's just the way things are. And Andrew doesn't accept that. So the fact that Canadian politicians seem to have about the worst record on earth for violating campaign promises and indeed doing exactly the opposite in office of what they would said they would do, and both federal and provincial. Most of us just shrug. Well, that's the game. And Anderson, why is that the game? And it bothers him. But he takes in this book. The reason this book is so important is he takes a lot of items that I and maybe others were intended to treat as individual problems,
Yes.
and to group them into a comprehensive critique of the way the Canadian democracy is malfunctioning. So Canada has this unbelievably powerful executive that isn't really answerable to anybody because it can't be, the prime minister cannot be challenged by his caucus or her caucus. It owes election to a party structure that comes into being specifically to elect the prime minister and then disappears forever. At the same time, Parliament doesn't work as well anymore. At the same time, there's a ticking time bomb of the Senate. And Andrew groups all of these things together. A point that in this book that is really, there are 2 points in the Carney years that are particularly urgent, and Andrew speaks to very well, and I really do recommend people read the book. Um, the first is that Carney comes from outside the world of politics into the world of politics with no experience in politics, but with a tremendous tendency to have his will prevail. He has been in jobs where, as governor of the central bank, he spoke, things happened. What is going to be the check on this man who also is genuinely very intellectually able and has a very high opinion of his intellectual abilities? Where is the check? How does, if he begins to make mistakes, how are those mistakes curbed before they result in real disaster? The caucus can't do it. No one else can do it. And the second point he directs attention to is uh, because the Senate doesn't work, there is no regional representation at the center of Canadian politics.
Yes.
Canada is governed in the interests of central Canada by central Canadians for central Canadians at the expense of Western regions. In other federal democracies, the United States and Australia, they get a voice, at least in their Senate. They have no such voice in Canada, which tends to empower premiers instead of senators. And the premiers have as their ultimate threat the threat of secession. So this Canada's like a marriage where the only thing that gets anybody's attention is the threat of divorce. So no disagreements are ever negotiated at the sub-crisis level through the daily interplay of politics. And this is especially urgent because, as we've often discussed, the right response to the Trump tariffs from Canada is not counter tariffs, but export taxes. But export taxes do not impose equally on every region of the country. They are going to fall much more heavily on the West and on Quebec than they will on Ontario and the Maritime provinces. So an effective response to the Trump challenge will put strain on the Canadian Confederation. And if there aren't people present at the center to say, Prime Minister, I'm a senator from your party, but I also represent Saskatchewan. And this potash export tax you're thinking of is going to bear very hard on my constituents. And we see the necessity for it, but you have to give us something else that we care
Yes.
about if we want us to endure the potash export tax. Or I'm from Quebec and I'm a senator of your party, and we have to pay the electricity export tax, or we have to impose it, and we get it, but you have to give us something. That dialogue doesn't happen, and it only happens when the premier of Alberta, the premier of Quebec says, "That's it. We're out of. If this continues, we're out of here." And then it's a
Yeah.
crisis and not a negotiation.
Yeah. Well said. David, in a previous life, you were a key figure in the gradual yet eventual merger of the fragmentation of Canada's political right. Um, Andrew, as you know, is one of the country's most consistent and powerful exponents of a shift to proportional representation,
Yeah.
which ostensibly would lead to a refragmentation of the right, as well as a lot of other dynamic
Yeah.
consequences for our electoral system and political parties. Reflecting in 2025, what's your view
Yeah.
on electoral reform, and including, incidentally, for the to address some of the regional issues that you just set out?
Um, over the years, I have changed my mind about this. So I used to be very skeptical of proportional representation because I was very influenced by the teaching of 19th century British parliamentary theorists that the purpose of elections was to produce governments.
Hmm.
And you wanted to produce a government that could act decisively and effectively. And first past the post produced stronger governments than proportional representation would. And and there are many British governments have historically been able to act more decisively than German or Italian governments have been able to act.
Yes.
The Israeli situation is just a warning of the potential. That's always like Italy and Israel are the two negative
Yes.
cases for proportional representation. But with the rise of these populist movements across the developed world, I increasingly wonder whether Andrew wasn't right, that it would be better if there were a if the pro-Brexit conservatives in Britain and the anti-Brexit conservatives were located in two different parties that had to formally negotiate rather than being locked inside one structure where one group informally pushed the other and held them to ransom. Whether Canada wouldn't be better off uh, if the kind of pro-institutional conservatives and the anti-institutional or the mistrustful institutional, they were in separate categories and they had treaties to cooperate on specific matters rather than trying to hold them into the same structure. Um, you know, uh, I think about this very much in the United States. If you had one party for Trump Republicans and another party for Romney Republicans, and then a party for like Biden Democrats and a party for left Democrats, um, I wonder whether you wouldn't get better government because the Romney and Biden Democrats could Romney Republicans could say, you know, we have a lot in common with these other guys, and you Trump Republicans, you can only hold us to ransom for so long before we say, you know what, on the reform of the tax code, we have a lot more in common with the Biden Democrats who, like us, they want the taxes higher, we want them lower, but we both agree they have to be consistent and rational. Um, and you are holding us to rants, and the Biden Democrats would feel the same way about the Democratic left. And it might be better if you had four parties that were negotiating each among the other. I didn't used to think that, but I have to say the circumstances of today are challenging my inherited view that what you want is first past the post to elect a strong and effective government.
Yeah, well said. It may be something we can take up in more detail in a future conversation
I mean,
because
people
I
need to read this
myself
book.
are going through some a similar evolution. Let's wrap up, David, with the final question. You mentioned that a lot of Andrew's diagnosis and prescriptions are ones that he's advanced for a long time. One of the principal obstacles against change or reform has been that the political principles have a lot of
Yeah,
disincentives to change the system that ostensibly is working pretty well for them.
yeah,
How do you build political momentum around a reform agenda to get at the heart of
yeah.
the crisis of Canadian democracy as Coyne sets out?
Yeah. Andrew, who's a very witty writer, makes this point in very funny ways through the book that there's a kind of tone of pessimism about the possibility. But as he ends the book, the reason you call it a crisis is, I mean, Canada's been through a long period of slow decay of institutions, including Parliament, especially Parliament. But the Trump challenge is really existentially threatening to Canada. And uh, the Carney government may find itself needing truly broad national unity to meet the challenges of Trump.
Yes.
Beginning with an obvious thing like the export, if export taxes are the way to go, and export taxes bear more heavily on Alberta and Quebec than they do on Ontario and New Brunswick, um, you have to give them something to get buy-in. And political reform may be the way to say to the Albertan, okay, well, you're going to bear the export taxes, but obviously, you need a louder voice in the councils of the center of the nation. Your premier should not be your ambassador to Ottawa. You need people in Ottawa who are in the room every single day, who are representing your interests. And when you have to give way, as on export taxes in the Western provinces and Quebec, I do believe you do need to give way. They need to get something back. They need to get something back. And power, enduring institutional power, is something they can get back.
Yeah. Great insight as always, David. We covered a lot of stuff, and as always, you shared your insight and wisdom. I can't wait to catch up in a couple of weeks.
Well, and
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
I'm glad we both admire Andrew so much, and it's such a and and by the way, the office environment continues to be amazing, and also the hub goes from triumph to triumph thanks to you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.